Funding for ThinkTank is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation, the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, and the Smith Richardson Foundation.
Hi, I'm Ben Wattenberg. We are in California at the beautiful campus of Claremont McKenna College, which is just about 35 miles away from Los Angeles, the metroplex that has become the locus of what some have called the language wars. We have a report from the front. ThinkTank is joined by Ron Unz, architect of California's Proposition 227, the English for the Children initiative, and author of a recent piece in Commentary magazine entitled California and the End of White America. Stephen Krashen, professor of education at the University of Southern California and author of Condemned Without a Trial, Bogus Arguments Against Bilingual Education, and Mark Lopez, visiting fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California and assistant professor at the University of Maryland's School of Public Affairs. The topic before the House, the battle about bilingualism, this week on ThinkTank. Teachers, parents, and government officials in America have long struggled with how to teach English to non-English speaking children. In recent decades, California has been at the center of the argument. Latinos currently make up about 30% of California's population, projected to grow to plurality status in the decades to come. How public schools can best serve a growing number of Spanish-speaking children is on the national front burner as well.
In some places, even the idea of bilingual education is controversial. It should not be. Today, I want to spotlight the dual language approach, which is also sometimes referred to as two-way bilingual or dual immersion.
The latest turn in California's struggle to get it right occurred in 1998 when voters solidly passed Proposition 227, which dismantled the state's bilingual education system. Peter Skerry, author of Mexican Americans, the Ambivalent Minority, has thought about it.
Those who are upset with bilingual education, those many Americans who are upset with it, who think that bilingual education is an effort by immigrants or immigrant leaders to forestall or put off assimilation or even a push for some sort of separatism are simply misconstruing this. Immigrant parents want their children to become part of American society, want them to learn English. It's a question of how they go about it and what kind of help they get.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on ThinkTank. Mark Lopez, let's begin with you and we'll go around the room quickly. What is the status of the language tension in Southern California today?
Well, there is a large number of students in Los Angeles County and in Los Angeles schools who do not speak English, and that number continues to grow. So clearly these students are going to need some sort of assistance, and they speak many languages, upwards of 50, 60 languages in Los Angeles Unified alone. And that's a tremendous task that needs to be addressed, a tremendous service that needs to be offered.
Steve?
The situation now, it's very difficult to know what the situation now is. We have a large population of limited English proficient children. It's not getting any less. It'll probably continue to grow. It's difficult to say what the impact has been of the changes of the laws because we haven't had controlled studies to show it. Nevertheless, my impression is that with Sat9 testing, et cetera,
with what testing?
The Stanford testing that has gone on through the state, that it is not the case that Proposition 227 has helped anyone. I still am a believer in bilingual education.
We're going to come to that. Where are we just generally, Ron?
Well, I think in general, we're where we've always been, and that the vast majority of Americans want children who don't know English to be taught English in school. The vast majority of those children's parents, their immigrant parents, want them taught English. The difference now in California is that they are being taught English, where before they weren't.
Mark, maybe you can just give us a fill on some background, and please, both of you, feel free to join in. Let's just do some history.
Sure. Well, bilingual education has been around in the United States since about 1968. the federal government provided some sort of assistance, federal money assistance for programs, but various states followed course through the course of the 70s. California in particular passed a law, I believe it was in 1976, that required school districts to provide bilingual education assistance for students who are non-English speaking. Subsequently, that particular program has existed in California for quite some time up until just recently, where in 1998 voters in California passed Proposition 227.
And what did that require of the schools to do for the students? If a child didn't speak English, what happened in a bilingual class?
Well, generally speaking, what happens is that the student receives instruction in English. They learn to speak English. But in addition to that, their coursework in other subject areas is in their primary language or in their native language. So the idea behind bilingual education is to teach children to speak English, but at the same time to prevent that student from falling behind. We don't want the student to become academically deficient in any way. So all of their coursework, which they don't speak English, so why would you want to teach them mathematics in English if they don't understand English? Perhaps it's better to teach it in their native language so they can progress through mathematics.
Which in California, what caused all the brouhaha was essentially Spanish. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Yes. Is that right?
In fact, the majority of students in California who do not speak English are Spanish speakers, 75%.
Okay. Steve, so that was the deal. What happened? Is that how it was, how it developed, or did English sort of get shoved out a little bit?
Let me supplement what Mark said.
Please.
It was pretty much right on, I think.
Well, that's why we have experts here. We have, let's say, we get
Gosh, thanks.
Right.
Anyway, what happens when you give a child good education in the primary language, in addition to good English as a second language, you give the child knowledge. That knowledge makes the English they hear in class later on more comprehensible and helps English language development. If a child knows history, knows where Afghanistan is, knows when World War II was, and then gets a history class in English, it's going to be more comprehensible, which is going to accelerate English language development. Number two, when you give a child literacy in the primary language, it's a shortcut to English. Now, if a child is English dominant, is born in the United States and speaks English better than he speaks Spanish, I do not recommend bilingual education. I recommend English language education with perhaps Spanish enrichment. So this has to do with the idea of misplacement. There have been a few very well-publicized cases in the media where children who do not belong in bilingual programs were misplaced in bilingual programs. Linda Chavez's son, for example. These were errors. They shouldn't have happened. They've been publicized far out of proportion to the frequency with which they occur. But those children should not be in bilingual education.
Okay. Now, you want to pick up the history?
Well, I think what Professor Krashen said is exactly what it was designed to do in theory, and that was the justification for bilingual education theory. The problem is it never worked in practice in 30 years, either in California or anywhere else in the country. In practice, the vast majority of the students in California public schools who were classified as not knowing English were born in the United States or came to school when they were 5 or 6 years old. At that young age, it's very quick and easy to learn another language. And the bottom line is, under the existing system, they were in these so-called bilingual programs for 3 years, 5 years, generally 7 years. In fact, the theory behind bilingual education is that it takes children 7 years to learn English, which is complete nonsense. The problem is that they were put in these programs, and even though in theory they were being taught English, most of these programs apparently, at least the Spanish language ones, involved as little as 30 minutes a day of English. And if a child comes from a language family where they're mostly talking Spanish at home, and they go to school, and they get 5 hours and 30 minutes a day of Spanish and only 30 minutes a day of English, you can see why it takes them 7 years to learn English.
That's a distortion. Practically nothing of what you said is true. And you should know better because we've been debating this again and again. First of all, the programs where they don't give children English 5 to 7 years to learn a language, this is completely false. In the good bilingual programs we have, children are exposed to English from the very first day. In very beginning levels, they may not have English all day. They're getting their core stuff in Spanish. But as soon as subject matter can be made comprehensible, it is taught in English as rapidly as possible.